In just 60 seconds. So take a seat, get comfortable, and think up some good questions or comments. Okay, let's start right over here. We're going to start here. We'll come around to you next. Now, before you go, new rules. You gotta take 12 seconds to tell us who you are and what you do.
David Bigster, retired management consultant. What happened in 1988 that made health and social security begin to explode? You pointed that out as a specific date when the trend lines diverged. Was it a demographic change or was it legislative?
That's a very good question. What is driving healthcare costs today are two things. And in fact, we did a big study of this. We took healthcare costs, this is the Dukakis Center, and we took it out to 2030. And we tried to ask the question, how much will healthcare grow and what will cause it to grow? The first was just population growth. So we expect population to grow by about 30 or 40 million people by the year 2030. I thought a lot of it would be demographic as we're aging. It turns out that's a tiny part of it. I was surprised. Because of course, as we get older, I'm one of them, we use more healthcare. The third that I thought was just inflation, that healthcare cost is becoming more expensive for the same treatment. That turns out not to be very important either. What turns out to drive healthcare costs is utilization rates, that we're utilizing more and more healthcare all the time. Those of us who are my age or older, just ask yourself, what is the cost of the medications you take every day that didn't exist 30 years ago? Or the kind of surgery we can have today so that we don't have to hobble around on weak knees or bad hips. Routine. And so it's mostly utilization that's driving it. I'm not quite sure what drove 88. I'll have to go back and think about Medicare and Medicaid, whether there were any changes there or expansions. But the things that are really driving it today are utilization. Who you are and what you do.
My name is Hannah Banks, and I run a video blog called WhyTheDemocrat.org. And I want to know if I loved all the elaborate stuff that went on in today's discussion, but I want to know specifically if the limit on Social Security taxable income were raised to $250,000, would that solve the Social Security problem?
Let me take a crack at it, maybe. Mr. Mayor, you have it. I have a dear friend named Joe Quinn, and Joe is probably one of the leading national experts on Social Security. And you have Medicare, and you have Social Security. If you actually look at the numbers, and he's at the Center for Retirement Studies at Boston College, Social Security is really easy to fix. We can assure full funding of Social Security into the next century, 2100 and beyond, by small little changes. Raising the retirement age a little bit over time, a month per year for the next 5 years. Raising the cap on how much we pay into Social Security, maybe up to about $250,000. The increase would be less than 1% in terms of people's average income, and it would secure Social Security forever. Medicare, on the other hand, there is no easy solution to that, and that's why so much is going to go into the cost containment. No one in this room, anyone my age, even young folks here who are not thinking about getting their Social Security check for another 40 years, don't worry, it's going to be there. Easy to fix.
Can you just say where you're from?
I'm from Newton.
Thank you. All roads lead to Newton. I just, this Social Security question, Hannah, I love the fact that you asked that. As Barry said, and I talked about a little bit last year, if you do go above that $108,000 cap, and if you go up to $250,000, you can make the adjustment. It was done back in the early 80s with Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. They understood that you had to raise the cap in order to make the adjustment. This is not a complicated fix. I believe there's a lot of ideological argument that's going into this. As Barry said, again, Medicare is a different question. And this idea of managing healthcare costs through the patient is absolutely correct. The healthcare provider looking at the patient holistically and saying, what is it going to take to get this patient healthy versus the number of medications, number of tests. So, and there are things going around the country right now. There are healthcare providers that are actually seeing success in containing costs by looking at the patient's care holistically and not having various doctors and otherwise provide different types of tests. So looking at it, and so I think there's a lot of room there. And one last thing, community hospitals are an important equation in this. Their capacity to provide that kind of service is vitally important. The Affordable Health Care Act actually helps to boost community hospitals' capacity to do that. And it's something that people don't talk about in the Affordable Health Care Act, so I wanted to mention.
That would be like Newton Wellesley?
That is not a community hospital.
Okay. One take. Here, back here.
Yeah.
Whoop.
Holly Wilbur, I work on the administrative staff of a life science investment firm. I just wanted to comment from my personal perspective about some of the things that you said, and I can remember when President Kennedy was shot, Walter Cronkite bringing the country together. And then I remember through my teenage years, until I was arrested in the Pentagon in 1970, protesting the war, the country coming apart again. And it was civil rights, it was men and women's rights, it was the war. And I think one of the things that you had to do to dissent at that time was you had to invest personally. You marched on Washington. You had to come together to make your dissenting point. I'm concerned now that with Twitter, you don't have to invest. You have to, it becomes noise. You send off just this unthinking reaction, there's no investment. And so I think that in fact contributes to a divisive noise that has become very disruptive today.
Any thoughts?
As someone who advertises the fact you could sign up for my Twitter account, I'm a participant in this thing. And, I actually think that Barry's point is right on. And again, for all of us out there, whether you're Barry Bluestone or you're Setti Warner's mayor, or whether you're President Barack Obama, it's like an arms race. Everyone wants to make sure that their point of view is louder. Everyone wants to make sure that their point of view saturates more markets and neighborhoods and people. So there is a question as to where this is going. There's a lot of tweets and blog postings that are not substantive at all. And you now have a universe, as Barry said, where everyone can sort of decide which Twitter person they're going to follow and what blog they're going to follow. So I do think it's a question for all of us in the next 10 years. Really, I look at this next 10, 20 years. Where will we be able to, as a society, go to a place, look for a place where you can see both 3, 4, multiple viewpoints and make a decision versus going to one? I think where we're going now is, for many of us, you have to look at, as Barry said, and he hinted at it, you have to look at as many as you can in order to come to a conclusion versus taking one or two. And I think that the market, I'm going to use the market here, and then I'll give it up. I think that the market, because I do think people are starting to say, wait a second, I'm getting all these tweets, I'm getting all these messages, I need to figure out where I can find news. And I think there's going to be a market for a place where people can find news in the next 10 years or so. I think people are going to start looking for, let's get away from the clutter and the slanted sort of viewpoints, and let me just try to figure out what's going on. So I think with this oversaturation and the sort of arms race that's out there, I actually think it could go in the other direction. It's my viewpoint, because I hear this quite often.
You know, I think about it, and you're going the same road I am, technology. And you realize that every time we introduce a new technology, we get some wonderful new things about it. Facebook allows us to spend time with our friends, Twitter allows us to do other things, email. But almost every new technology has unintended consequences. We invent, electric appliances, and then people get electrocuted. Right? Automobiles, and 50,000 people lose their lives on our highways. And this may be the unintended consequences of the new electronic technologies that allow everyone to have precisely the specific things they want. Right? And we have to figure out how to deal with those unintended consequences. I must tell you that part of the reason why Mike Dukakis and I, along with Setti and Speaker DeLeo and Senator Chandias, wanted to do this course so much and bring the people we're bringing together who are from across the spectrum, is to give us one place where we can hear the different voices, the different perspectives, and let us really tussle with that rather than simply reinforce what we have. But it will be interesting to see whether we move toward a technology that takes the current technologies and finds a way to reduce the unintended adverse consequences and bring us back together as we did in that moment with a tear in his eye, Walter Cronkite, on November 22nd, 1963.
Good evening. Bill Biggs from Danvers, and I work for a state representative. I do his constituent services up in the State House. I'm also just finishing, retired 9 years on the school committee in Danvers. My question, the market goals, the market goods versus the right is just, it's fabulous, and but it's constantly evolving. And that's part of the problem. But one of the things we do in Danvers, even with our town meeting, is we demand that it's ladies and gentlemen always. We need, how can you as leaders help us to have people have discussions in respectful ways? And then we'll make the continual evolving will work out better. How do you lead us to that?
How do we go back to civil discourse? Mr. Mayor?
So it's a great question. And I can tell you what I think I've seen in Newton in the last 3 years on issues large and small. There are 3 elements that I think are very, very important. Number one, first and foremost, people have to have trust and confidence in a process. Why is process important in leadership? It's important because people need to understand why and how you are going to make a decision. If they think it's self-interest, if they think it's based on a favor, politically or otherwise, and it's not for the public good, then they're not going to have confidence in the conclusion. Process is important. Leader has to lay out how they are getting to the conclusion, where they're leading. Number 2, I think that transparency is incredibly important in that process. I'm all about laying the cards on the table. I'm all about opening up the books. Number 3, and I think this is vitally important in the long run, people need to know that you are being as efficient and effective as you can. With every taxpayer dollar, with every decision you make, the use of your time, the use of the city's time, use of the community's time. And you have to have vision. I'm going to add that at the end. Why did I lay those 4 things out? When I walked into office, and I'll be very brief, when I walked into office, we had 17 union contracts up. 17. Healthcare was outpacing our revenue stream. We had to go to the table with all the unions, and we knew we didn't have enough money to pay for the healthcare costs. Number one, we laid out a process, and we were transparent about it. With all the unions, with our community, I did 28 town hall meetings around the budget. I was transparent about it, and I showed people what numbers we needed to get at. Number two, made sure that people had ultimately confidence in the decision making, and we were being as efficient as we could with every public dollar. Number three, our goal and vision was to make sure that we provided the community with the best services we could. And that was the vision. And we had to stay within a percentage on compensation in healthcare, and that was 2.5%. I laid all that out in the beginning. No one thought we could get these union contracts done when I was running for office or when I walked into office. All 17 were up. I told all the unions 2.5% combined compensation and healthcare. We needed to stay at that because that matched revenue. Some of the dialogue got rough, internally at the table and externally. Got a little rough. New tab, Boston Globe, all sorts of things were going on. But I used those principles. Earlier this year, all 17 union contracts were signed. And they all have their compensation and healthcare costs rise at 2.5%. We did it in 2 years because I used that method. And it was hard. It was very, very hard. So, do I think it can be done? Absolutely. But leaders in government have to be willing to take risks and put themselves out there. Be honest, tell the truth, not be afraid to get hit, not be afraid of the political consequences. And I got hit multiple times by all sides last year and the year before. People saying, well, he's going to give too much to the unions on one side. On the other side, people were saying, you're not taking, the unions saying, we got to make sure you take care of our health care and compensation. But we got it done. So I illustrate that because I do think it can be done with that approach.
I have to tell you one quick story, and I should have learned from my friend the mayor. I actually spent time in Truro, Massachusetts, a small town, 1,500 people, and all of our work is done through town meeting, like in Denver, in your community. And I somehow, by being an economist, got everybody to hate me. Years ago, a law was passed that said that all the dumps, the old dumps where you dump stuff and they pour sand over it, had to be closed, and every community had to build a transfer station, modern transfer station with a compactor and all that. And Truro went ahead and did it, but Provincetown, the town to our north, did not. And finally, the town of Provincetown came to our town meeting and said, look, we need a compactor, we need to use this, we can't do it, would you allow us to use yours? We'll pay for it, we'll put in a second compactor, and we'll pick up all the costs of your sanitation department. So this goes to town meeting, and it became pretty a violent discussion about whether we wanted to receive Provincetown garbage. Because you know about Provincetown. It's different than our garbage. In any case, somebody on the town council knew I was an economist and said, could you do a study for us and tell us what the consequences might be, particularly in terms of traffic? And so I went to the Cape Cod Commission, I got the data they gave me, and I did this whole study and came to the conclusion that in fact it wasn't going to be a traffic problem. And we didn't have to put a light on Route 6, if you know where Truro is. And I took this to the town meeting, and the half of the people who were violently opposed to having Provincetown garbage in their compactor just assaulted me like that. It was then found out, however, that the data I got from the Cape Cod Commission was faulty. And so I was presented with the right data, and I went back and I found out, well, as a matter of fact, there was going to be a traffic problem, and I reported this, at which point everybody who supported and as a result, I've not been back to town meetings since 1988. Other questions?
Gary,
No, you gotta introduce yourself.
I run a nonprofit called so happy.
You don't have to apologize.
Very early on, you set up a sort of structure for the discussion and said, government, how much do we want, how many services do we want, and then there was a long list of how much everything costs. My observation is that there's no line there that's labeled waste, fraud, and abuse. And the trick in the public policy discussion is to get people even to focus on the legitimate, do we want to pay for this, do we want to pay for that? Because it is so easy for people that don't want to take responsibility for making our choices to say, we'll just cut waste, fraud, and abuse. If we just got rid of those people who were on disability, or we didn't do something right, but we're stealing whatever, and every now and then there's a story in the paper that says that, we've managed to cover everything. We don't have to make hard choices. And I guess that's more of a statement than a question, so I'll put a question mark on the end of it by saying, do you have any observations of how one deals with that, particularly in the divisive political partisan context that we've got, to get people to actually have that legitimate prioritization?
Well, first of all, every organization can become more effective and can become more efficient. That is not to say they aren't effective or efficient, but they can become more so. I'm a great fan of our governor, and particularly what he's doing with the Administration and Finance Office. I'm on the kitchen cabinet for Jay Gonzalez, who's the Secretary of ANF. And they've been having a very intensive program of going agency by agency by agency to see how we can make those agencies both more effective, meaning meeting the mission's goal, the goal of the mission, and more efficient, doing it at minimum cost. And I think that's important to convince people that, in fact, they're getting their dollar's worth, and you need to show that. Efficiency and effectiveness was precisely in the mayor's comments just a few seconds ago. And I think that's a critical part of what we should be doing at state government, local government, and federal government, so that people feel they're getting their money's worth. But I think equally important, and that's why I went through that long list and I was losing my breath doing it, is that people just take government for granted. All kinds of services. And as a result, they can say foolish things about wanting to cut government, but then if you ask them, tell me what you want to cut. And it's very hard for people to come up with answers to that question, and I'm hoping in this election that Mr. Ryan and Mr. Romney will answer that for us. You know, you say you're going to cut because you're going to cut taxes, you're going to have to cut a lot of spending. What will you cut? And I think that's the question that should be asked this year.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that's a critical question. I think sometimes we in government, when I say we, I mean people in the legislature, even some chief executives, make the mistake of making the argument that we've cut to the bone, we need more money. You can cut to the bone, but not be efficient and effective in how you're spending taxpayer dollars. Barry's point is absolutely correct. One of the first, there's two things I did when I got elected. I put in place zero-based budgeting, which meant that I didn't assume what we spent in every department was what we should spend the following year. We looked at every line item, we made it transparent, and we put performance management in place where our budgets were based on outcomes. I put scorecards on our website so people could see how we deliver services, how efficient they were, and I put the numbers on our savings around zero basing. That's really important. It's not about necessarily making government smaller, it's making government more effective and smarter. So that's a critical element. In addition to that, I think it's up to us, me, and other politicians in elected positions to show people how government does affect their lives, to connect the dots. That's hard to do, as Barry said, because there is a disconnect, but we have to find ways to illustrate that. Those two things are things at every level of government. We have to do better. I work at it every single day, but I think that's really important for the future and making investments later on, things we talked about.
Let me tell you about two experiences, very quickly. One was with Comcast. I told you we have a house in Truro, and we finally we got rid of our big giant TV and we put in a flat screen TV, but you've got to get a new cable box, a digital one. So I wanted to trade in my digital box, but I wanted to know when is the cable box Comcast folks in Provincetown, where I thought they were, when are they open? So I called the 1-800-INFINITY number, whatever it is, and I talked with a very nice gentleman in Manila, in the Philippines. Could not answer that question for me. And I finally asked, I said, could you at least give me the phone number of the office in Provincetown, or the nearest office, Orleans, wherever it is, so I can call and get their hours of operation, which he also did not know. I'm sorry, sir, there is no phone number. So finally I get in my car and I drive to Provincetown. And indeed, the Comcast office is still where it is, and I walk in and there's a woman sitting there, by the way, with a phone in front of her. And I trade in my cable box, but I say, I wanted to call you here to just make sure I wasn't taking a meaningless trip. Could you give me this phone number? She says, I can't give you the phone number, they won't let me give it out. I said, does anybody have this phone number? She said, yes, my mother. I said, could you tell me where your mother lives? This went on. This is Comcast, a private corporation. The next day I had to replace my vehicle registration through our registry of motor vehicles. I did it in 13 seconds on the internet, and the next day I had my tag, and I said, this is public, that is private, who would I rather be working with? And it turns out, the state. I think that's fine. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Over here.
My name is Justin. I'm an alum of the MPA program here, and I'm currently working for the City of Boston. Just a little bit of pushback on your idea, if you don't mind, about the golden age of media and everything. And there are some things that it's a big topic in the news and everything, and lots of people write different theories about polarization. And some things I've read recently suggest that really the age of Cronkite is the anomaly, and in fact that there were lots of partisan newspapers during the colonial days and the Revolutionary era, and in fact the 50s, 60s, and 70s were sort of the break away from what has been the norm. And just wondering your thoughts on that. And quick corollary to that is, I wonder if you have considered the role that civil rights has played in the polarization, where there was previously this uneasy alliance between Northern Democrats, pro-New Deal, and the segregationists, and then, all the liberal Republicans now have become Democrats and vice versa, and just wondering how that plays in your mind.
Right. Well, number one, I'll have to look into this whole question of the media in earlier times. It's a fascinating question, and I think we sometimes don't take into account as much how our political ideas come into our heads and the role of media. And I think that's important. I've actually been looking very much at the polls very, recently, and I've been looking at, who's voting for whom by race, by ethnicity, by age, and all that. And I realized, having looked at this, and I think it has something to do with the civil rights movement, it has something to do with, the women's movement, is that there's one simple change we could make in America that, in my opinion, would improve society dramatically, solve so many problems, and that would be simply to pass a constitutional amendment to eliminate the voting franchise for white men. White men overwhelmingly are voting highly conservatively. I'm a white guy. I'm willing to give it up if all the other white guys would. One more question. What? Over here. Wait for the mic if you would, and tell us who you are.
My name is Joel Sharandi, and I am in the own a company which sells health insurance, pension products, and retirement products, and life insurance. And we've been in the healthcare business for a long time, over 50 years. But my comment is about what I thought you so succinctly said that was almost the answer to the end of the course, which is that all we have to do is to decide what services we want and how much taxes we're willing to pay to get there. It's a very simple statement. And at the end, when we listen to all of the sections of this program, that in itself is what America has to decide. That's what this election is all about. However, my comment and question is, I'm a little bit cynical about that because if you look at the state of California as a state that is dealing with that crisis for many years, they overwhelmingly always vote for more services, more entitlements, and more benefits. And they always overwhelmingly vote for no new taxes. And this is America's dilemma. Europe has seemed to solve the problem a long time ago. You do get some people that are fleeing France now and coming to Florida because they say they're going to have to pay 70% tax. But we can't seem to come to grips with that. And I guess my question is, how are we ever going to resolve the issues of the day, to resolve the conflict in Congress, to resolve what happens in the cities and towns when we, as citizens of America, cannot decide what we want? Well, we know what we want. We want more, but we can't, but we're unwilling to pay for it. Borrowing always seems to be the only answer.
Yeah. I think you're asking the $64,000 question for the whole course, for the whole semester. I think part of it, in our own little way, this class tries to raise that issue so that people think about that. I'd love to see this being done in 100 cities, 1,000 cities across the country, and really raise these questions about these things. One way of doing it, of course, is begin to put price tags on all of these things. You want this, it's going to cost this much, and this is how much we're going to raise your taxes. We do that in the city of Newton. Mayor has told us that you're going to be asking for an override this year, right? And when you do that, you're saying it's going to be for building schools or fixing the streets, and this is how much it's going to cost.
Newton Tab in here? Make an announcement for me here, Barry.
Oh, I didn't know this wasn't public. I'm sorry. But I think that's...
It is now.
It is now. But, you know, that works. I think California's system, and we have a little of it here, has a disease, and it's called the referendum. I mean, you can have hundreds of referendums. If you look at California, I mean, they spend, you know, much more on prisons than they spend on higher education. And part of the reason for that is you've got entrenched interests, including the security guard union, which comes up with, you know, 3 strikes you're out and 14 other ways of increasing the prison population because it leads to their own job security. What we hope we have in the legislature, we have at least one senator here, House member here, is a deliberative process that looks at how much we're spending and how much revenue we have and tries to figure out a way of making this go. But starting to think very much about what the price tag is when we decide we want that more you talk about seems to me something we need to do. So the 2 things I'd leave you with it tonight is, 1, you need to be effective and efficient, as the mayor was telling us, and you also have to be honest with people about what this is going to cost. But you also have to be honest with the people when you say, we are going to slash taxes and we are going to cut spending, but then don't tell people what you're going to cut that they may really want. Well, thank you for being here this evening. Let me suggest that we expect to have a very full house next week for Larry Summers and Greg Mankiw. For those of you who have been coming regularly, I hope you'll get a seat, so you might want to come a little bit early, grab a seat, put something down on it, and hold it, because I think we're going to have quite an evening next week. Thank you very much. Wonderful to have you. Drive carefully.